Welcome to the Demystifying Technology podcast from the MacLaurin Group.
Typically, you go through the due diligence process with the world of private equity.
Right. Can't wait. Demystify it.
On this week's Demystifying Technology episode, Alan and Ryan discuss version control, the bedrock of any software engineering team. Life has no form, edit, undo, but your software department can. Now let's join Alan and Ryan to learn more about version control, getting beneath the concepts, making you that little bit more informed.
Ryan, what is version control?
So at its core, version control is the process of keeping copies of a file, right? So generally when you're using version control, you want to be keeping a record or a history of changes that are being made to a file. And so version control is just that concept of keeping those copies in that kind of log book of what's been changed on a file.
So generally speaking, version control centers around the management of a file.
Correct.
And that's our core asset when we're talking about version control. So where do we usually see this?
So most people actually have probably interacted with this in one way or another, just out in the wild. A very good example would be if you've ever used G Suite and specifically like Google Docs. Google Doc, just by its nature, is kind of keeping a version history as you're editing the file. And so a lot of times what you can see is not only can you kind of see what people have come in and changed, but you can even go back and say, oh, well, I wrote this paragraph, but I don't really like it. Let me go back to what it was before, and you can kind of go back and look at the history and roll back to it. So at its core, that is version control. And there's plenty of other systems. Like anytime you've gone into a system, made a change, and you're basically doing a Control-Z and undoing in a lightweight fashion, that is version control. You're able to undo and roll back to a previous version of a file.
Okay, I don't understand this Control-Z thing. We call it Control-Z, but we'll talk about that one later. So ultimately, the Google Docs one is a good example of that, because if you do go and sort of do the file local history thing in a doc or a sheet, you see the person that changed it and a highlight of where they changed it. Is that how it works in the development process as well?
Yes. So fundamentally, every time a developer makes a change to source code or a file, maybe a configuration file, that gets checked in. And from there, you can kind of go back, and it's an entry in the logbook, and you see, oh, well, Bill made this change on this date, and here's what he changed. And then later on, if Adam makes a change, you can go back and say, oh, well, here's where Adam changed the file. So you get that full kind of audit trail of here's where the file's been touched, who touched it, and what's been changed.
Okay, so it's quite easy to think of Google Docs or Office 365 in the version control there, because it's baked into the tool itself. Mm-hmm. But as a developer, what sort of tools and technology are we talking about here for these guys?
Well, so with developers, honestly, version control has been around for almost at least 50 years at this point. Go all the way back to the source code control system. But probably the more modern ones, go back as modern as 1990 here, would be CVS. CVS was the big one in the 90s. Subversion kind of became the natural version after that, and that was probably in the early 2000s to 2010. And then in probably like the past decade or so, it's really been Git. Git's been the one that's been taking over. And all of them are doing version. They're just different ways of doing the version, different products.
But they're all fundamentally in and around this same concept of managing the versions or the revisions of a file.
Exactly.
That's going forward there. And it's interesting to note that as an industry, we love to throw out the old and bring in the new in a heartbeat. I mean, we go through waves extremely fast. Fads come and go, languages come and go. Version control systems seem to have a lot more staying power than most frameworks or languages, etc.
Yeah, it's definitely a case of a lot of times once you get into a kind of a version control system, because it just kind of naturally works into your workflow as it was as a developer, a lot of times you kind of stay with it until there becomes a compelling reason to switch. Like even though Subversion's been around for 20, 30 years, there's plenty of shops that's still using it. Haven't seen CVS as much, but I'm sure there's still some shops out there using it. And there has to be a compelling reason to start moving to another one. A lot of times it's just a case of, okay, there's a new version like Git's becoming the popular one now, and it's just because it's made some aspects of version control easier to do for developers. But there's, like I said, plenty of shops that haven't made that switch because, again, if that's not the way you're kind of developing code, there's not a good reason to switch. So it's just kind of what fits the bill, and a lot of times because it's just that simplicity of just needing to be able to track what changes are being made, just because a new one comes out with a new feature, it doesn't really gain you much. So it doesn't worth switching.
And I think to give Git some sort of credit, I would say that it's a good candidate for the age in which it's in, because we're now in an environment where remote team working is so much more the norm. We're back in the older days, everybody was in the same office and you could actually communicate to each other that, hey, I'm touching this file, or hey, I'm doing that. But now with remote working over geographically large time zones, etc., the logistics of managing all these versions and all this history and people working the files become a lot more. And that's where I think Git has truly become a thing. So you talked a little bit earlier about this notion of a workflow. So give us a typical workflow for a developer and talk us through some of the sort of terminology here.
Right. So usually with a developer, when you're going to start your day, you want to make sure you have the most recent version of code before you start. Because obviously, if somebody has come in and made a change to a file, you want to make sure that when you go to change that file, it's up to date. Generally, the first thing they'll do is they'll go out and they will pull or check out code from the central repository.
So that's them taking a copy of what's on the remote server and bringing it back to their local machine.
Exactly. So once they have that copy, they then make whatever changes they need to make. Hopefully they do some testing on it locally. And then they've reached the point where they're like, okay, this is now ready for others to use or for somebody else to take a look at. And at that point, what they do is they'll do a check-in, effectively, where they'll push that change to that central repository, and the central repository will take that change, log the fact that, okay, here's what's changed, you're the person that checked it in, here's all the files. And then that makes it available for other people to then start pulling that copy to them.
So then the cycle begins again.
Exactly.
So there is this notion then that a central server maintains effectively the golden version or the golden copy of what it is. Okay, so that seemed a lot of extra steps there. So does that get in the way of a developer's workflow or general I just want to code?
So if you're a developer that's probably never used version control, yes, it's good to feel like, oh, well, why do I got to do these extra steps? But honestly, once you get the process defined, like that whole checkout, I mean, it's not like to make a copy where you're sitting there waiting 15, 20 minutes. Usually you're dealing with a process that takes 10 to 15 seconds. You issue a single command, say, hey, go grab the latest copy, and then you're off to the races.
And it's only getting the changes. It's not getting the
Yes.
whole. If you're working on a project that's 50 meg in size or 100 meg in size, you're not always pulling the 100 meg.
That's exactly it. And so, like, the first time you start working on a project, like if you're a brand new developer coming into a shop that has a rather sizable code base, sure, you may spend a little bit of time doing that initial download of all the various versions. But from there forward, everything should be a quick, all right, 10 to 15 second tops. You got all the copies, and then you're moving on. And same thing with check-in. The nice thing with the check-in is that most systems allow you to take a look at, before you check in, what changes are you about to commit to the central repository. And so that allows you to see and kind of do your own self-code review, right? To say, hey, here's how I've changed these files. Have I missed something? Have I typoed something? And then you commit it in. And again, that commit step, again, usually takes 5 to 10 seconds, nothing like that, and then you're on to your next project. So yes, the initial step into it can seem a little daunting, but once you get into it, it's just kind of part of your workflow. It's getting up in the morning, brushing your teeth, and then brushing your teeth again when you go to bed.
Got it. So it just becomes second nature. Okay. So let's pretend then I'm a developer, then I'm not working in a team. I'm a lone wolf. What's it buying me?
So obviously the main thing it's buying you is that ability to kind of go back and look at the history of changes made. So inevitably, if you're a developer, you start working on something and you realize, this isn't quite going well. So you want to be able to roll back and undo your changes, because it's kind of like, okay, well, this just isn't working. I thought this would work, but it's a lot bigger changes than I wanted. And you want to unwind those changes. Well, if you don't have version control and you didn't think to make a copy of that beforehand, that can be a very hard process now, because you got to try and remember, okay, what in all have I changed, and try and undo it. It also allows you to, along those same lines, kind of do the flights of fancy, right? There's this new tool out there that I want to try out, or there's this new library I want to try integrating. Again, you can kind of, a lot of times with version control, kind of go off on your own, do that, and if it works out, cool, you go ahead and check it in. Otherwise, you throw it away. The bigger one I think that I've experienced a lot of times is I had a way of doing something, and it worked great, and maybe I made that change a year ago. But then over time, I've changed it, modified it, and I reached that point where like, oh man, I'd really like to know how I did this in the past. And I can go back and look at the history and say, okay, well, what did this code look like a year ago? Because maybe I want to grab that and do it that way again because it worked well in that scenario and I want to use it again. So again, it just gets you that ability to easily undo, look at how you've changed things. It just gets you those benefits of being able to kind of like play around with your code a little bit more without risking getting yourself into a tangent where you're kind of stuck, right? And you got to kind of push forward because I don't really know how to undo my changes anymore. No, that shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, and I think, speaking personally, I like the notion of a milestone, this sort of marker that, okay, my project is at this state. I'm sort of freeze-framing this, or notion that, hey, last Monday everything was great. So I've got a known point to roll back to do what I need to do there. Okay, so that's from a developer's point of view. As an organization, though, why would I want to enforce version control onto my development team?
So as an organization, what version control gains you is it's that concept, your code is centralized. It's on a server, likely something you own, or it's somewhere where obviously everybody can access it at once. So it's no longer this case of, well, Bob got hit by a bus, where's Bob's code?
It's on Bob's laptop.
Yeah, well, where's Bob's laptop? Yeah. So you don't have that concept of where's my code or even basically the lifeblood of my business residing at the moment. Well, you know where that is. It's in the central location. With everybody checking in and managing it centralized, again, you get that audit trail. So you get to see, okay, well, who broke this feature or who put in the security vulnerability or how did we get to this state? You can kind of go back and look and see how things have changed over time to determine how did we get here. Right. Especially if there's needs to be some accountability to why have we gotten to this point. Along those lines, again, talking in terms of security, it allows you to secure your code. So you control now who has access to that code and that central repository. So not just anybody can come in and make changes to the code. You're allowing them access to your code so that audit from that side in terms of who has accessed and viewed my code. Because again, a lot of times with code, I mean, when you're talking code, that's a lot of times the secret sauce of your business. Yep. So you want to know who's seeing that, viewing that, editing it. So it just gets you that ability to have tighter control over that.
A couple of things here as a word of caution to those that are listening. The number of check-ins does not equal the quality of development.
No.
There was a time I was watching those pretty graphs of, look, Bob is the most checked in. No, yeah. Bob is, let's talk about Bob.
Yeah, it's definitely, it used to be probably a case of smaller, more frequent check-ins because it was easy to say, oh, well, he did 20 check-ins today. He must be doing a lot. Well, especially with some of the newer methodologies, it's maybe a case of you check in once a day or maybe once a week. But it's definitely, again, you get to see that. What did Bob actually change? Is Bob just going in and adding spaces at the end of things?
So one of the things that talked to me about, Ryan, which you mentioned it a little bit here, and so the larger an organization gets, the more departmentalized an engineering group will get. So you talk, for example, the secret sauce of a particular stuff. And we all know as an engineering group, there are programming tasks, programming functionality that's more what you consider bread and butter housekeeping. There's nothing really unique about it. We just got to code this thing up. Versus the sort of, well, here's our core algorithm that takes in our readings from this sensor, and this is how we then come up with that secret figure that we produce, etc. Right? Does version control make it easier for me as an organization to keep, say, for example, that stealth, the Coca-Cola recipe away from all the other developers so they don't get to see that, but they still get to benefit from its usage?
Yeah, so almost all version control systems, while you have this central server where all these files are getting checked into, most of them have the concept, and from a high level, you can almost think of as projects, right? So there will be this project where there will be files that reside underneath the project. And from there forward, you can control who has access to each of those individual projects. So it's not a case of, oh, well, Bob has access to the server, so Bob can see everything that's checked into the server. You can say, oh, well, Bob can have access to this project, this project, this project. And you can even go as far as saying, okay, Bob has write access to this one, but he only has read access to this other one. So you can generally, almost all modern version control systems have that granularity of access to the server, so you can tightly control what can they see.
And that's very handy for when you're bringing on, say, contractors or new employees that you don't necessarily want to open up everything
Correct.
To them until they've got that sort of sense of how we work and how we manage things.
100%, because it'll probably be a case of they're building some API or something around the core logic, so they don't need to see what the core code is. You don't even want them to have a copy of that because you don't want to run the risk of them being
Leaking it out.
Exactly. So you can just say, okay, well, I'm creating this new project for you to go check your code in. So again, they get that benefit of checking the code in, but they don't ever get to see the other code. They only ever interact with the binaries or the third party where, yeah, they're interacting with, but they don't get to see the actual source code tied to it.
Got it. Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper here. Let's not get too geeky out because I need to stop you here. But you've used a number of terms. You've used commit, you've used checkout. So let's put some meat in those bones. Give us some of the sort of the top terminology that you would hear floating around in a general sort of engineering workflow, project management type conversation, and hit me with some of these.
Right. So I think at the base one, so when I was talking about the developer's workday, you have the concept of pushing and pulling. So you got get push, get pull. With SVN or subversion, that's generally a checkout or a check-in. But at its core, the action is you are pulling code from the central repository or you're pushing code to the central repository. The next one is going to probably be the concept of a branch.
Okay, we haven't talked about branches. Hit me with a branch.
So a lot of times when you're working on code as a team, there's going to be people working on a variety of features. Bob may be working on feature A, Adam is working on feature B. At that point, they need to be able to kind of work on their copies, but not overlap their commits. So what you can do is you can create what's called a branch. And a branch is, if you're thinking of this in terms of a timeline, right, it's an alternate timeline. So you choose a point in time, and you're going to branch off and start creating your own new timeline. The main timeline's still flowing along, perfectly fine, but it allows the developer to work on their own separate timeline, make their commits, and it allows them to kind of work in isolation from the other until they get to a point that they need to merge back.
Merging. We've heard things called merge hell before.
Yes, and it's very easy to get into. It's also very easy not to get into it. It's just one of what's your strategy. So with merging, it's basically when you're trying to bring the timelines back together, right? So this is at the point where the developer's been on his own timeline, but he's ready to put it back to the main timeline. And when he wants to do that, he basically needs to make sure that his changes can merge into what other changes may have been done to those files. So really the only time you get yourself into, as you put it, merge hell, is when the developer has made modifications to a number of files that other developers have changed. And most revision systems now have gotten really intelligent where even to that point, it's not the same file. It's got to be the same line of the file, right? So I changed line 100, you changed line 100, so we need to resolve what should line 100 look like now at this point in time. So that's merging effectively. You're going in, you're taking your changes and making sure it works with what other changes people have made to get to a final working state. The nice thing with merging, if done correctly, is a lot of times you put the onus on the developer that's making the change. So he's obviously the one that's made the changes, so he knows what the end result is supposed to be.
Right, so before you go down that path, now, from a good sort of, I'm a good steward of this system, what should that developer have done before he checks in? Because he just can't simply say, I'm right.
Right.
No, not everybody's like me, I mean, let's be frank. And I don't care what anybody else has made the changes of.
Yeah.
You're taking mine. So no, but that's not how it works in this.
No, so if you've done a branch, so when you get into that merge phase, effectively what you're going to do is you're going to do kind of another pull. So you're going to go and say, okay, pull the most recent changes, and that way it allows you to start merging them into the most recent one.
You take responsibility for what else has happened in an alternative timeline.
You're basically now going back and looking at, okay, what's gone in that timeline, and how does my changes get layered on top of it correctly? But it leaves it up to the developer to do that, because obviously he's going to be the one that knows what changes should be made. It's not just the system, and he's not coming in, because the last thing you want, as you've experienced before, is somebody to come in and just say, yeah, I'm right, and they override it, and then what can happen is basically you lose some changes somebody else has made. And I say lose here in terms of you lose it at that point in the timeline. The beauty, again, of version control is if that ever happens and you realize, oh, well, why is this feature no longer working? Again, you look at the logbook and you say, oh, well, Bob came in and overrode my change. And so it allows you to easily go back and pull it out and do a proper merge at that point.
Yeah. I think clearly Bob needs to have a bit of a chat with.
Yeah.
He's a problem child. We're going to come back to Bob soon. Right, so you've outlined all this stuff. All great. Fantastic. Is this all or nothing? How much can I embrace version control? What can I dip my toe in the water?
Yeah, so obviously at its simplest form, what you would have is a central server, or even, let's make it even more basic, you have a central spot to store files, and you put copies of them there. So obviously, hopefully you're using something like Subversion, because again, it gets you more of that logbook and you're checking a number of other features. But at its core, you're just checking files in. Maybe a case of you're only checking in and pulling out, you're never doing anything else beyond that. You could be the only one on it. But at that point, again, it just gets you that history and being able to see what's changed and be able to roll back and do that sort of thing. You can also go full bore, so I'm sure this will be another topic for us in the future. A big thing nowadays is what's called CI/CD, which is continuous integration, continuous deployment. And what that means from kind of a high level is you hook into your version control system such that every time somebody checks in, an automated flow starts kicking off where it's going to be, okay, Bob just checked in. We know Bob has some trouble, so we're going to start running automated tests. We're going to compile the code. We're going to do whatever needs to be done to get the code ready, and then we're even going to take the step of maybe deploying it out to the development environment. So that's where you start getting into these more complex, but again, basic form, central server, just check stuff in.
Yes, and we're going to have a future podcast now because that's an exciting area that I feel that as we look at our clients and other portfolios, etc., they're not really embracing that side of version control. There are many organizations not even doing version control yet because a little bit intimidated by it. It's nothing to be intimidated by, but yes, that's definitely worthy of a future discussion. Now, a couple of last questions here before we finish up. What really shouldn't you put in version control? What's the no-nos that Bob needs to get his fingers rubbed?
So generally, you should never check in any credentials, right? So if you have anything that's kind of an access key and secret, a username and password, things that sensitive information allows access to other systems, it's generally very frowned upon to be checking that sort of stuff in.
So where do I put my MySQL database credentials?
Put them somewhere else that has another set of security around it.
And we're going to talk about that one at a later date because I think that it's probably... if one was to be sweeping statement time here, which I'm loving, security management is something that's done very poorly.
Yes. And
it's not done poorly from out of a conscious, I don't care about security. It's because of a tight deadline. I'm going to come back and do this right. Yeah. Or there's something that's just...
I just need to hard code this to get over the line.
Yes,
that
and
sort
then
of
we
thing,
forget about on-hard coding.
Yes.
So we'll come back to that one. Okay, so you kept talking about the word server. And anybody that's listening to this will probably think, oh God, I have to run up another server. There's more infrastructure you're making me maintain. What's the story here, Ryan?
So because, again, version control has been around so long, there is a lot of options out there. So yes, you could run your own server, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But at the same time, if you're just getting started in this, or especially if you're doing something that's not necessarily super secret, take, for example, maybe you want to get into open source or something of that nature, there's plenty of software as a service offerings out there. So probably one of the most popular ones at the moment, especially for public stuff and open source projects, is GitHub. So it allows you to have unlimited free repositories. It's free. Like for all intents and purposes, you can just consider that free. So it allows you to have version control where you are not running a server, you just use it as a service. There's plenty of other more proprietary services like that allow you to pay and allows you to have more privacy features and security. So that's where the likes of GitLab has kind of carved out their space. They allow you to have their own private repos. If you're not into
you've
Git...
used another term on us here. What's a repo?
So a repo is... So when I mentioned earlier the concept of you can break files into different projects, that's a repository.
Repository equals project in this
Yes.
world. Okay,
Yep.
keep going.
So in terms of the other ones, you got the likes of Bitbucket. Bitbucket is the Atlassian product. So if you're using Jira, you've probably come across it. But if you're a company where, again, you got the secret sauce or you're reaching a certain size, you may not want your code to reside out on somebody else's servers. You want to maintain control over that. So at that point, that's where you probably would look to run your own server inside either your own data center or in your own AWS account, whatever that may be.
Although if you're running your own server in AWS account, then what's the benefit versus, say, code commit, which is AWS's?
So basically, it comes down to you generally have feature set. So there may be, so take for example, GitLab makes it generally pretty easy. While they have a cloud offering where you can use it as a service, they also make it very easy to run your own in-house server on its own hardware. And GitLab, I would say, has a lot more richer features around the code management system than the likes of Code Commit. Like Code Commit is great if you're looking just for version control and just kind of the basic Git feature set. But if you're trying to do a richer set of options, then maybe it's GitLab. I mean, again, it may just be a case of that's what you're familiar with or where you're coming from.
Okay, so give me some meat in these bones. How much money am I going to have to go and beg the CFO for?
So obviously, if you're using something like GitHub, which is some of the like free ones, nothing. It's free. If you are looking to
and they do now private repos now.
They do some private repos. I can't remember.
It's only for personal accounts. It's not
GitLab has private repositories for free as well, I believe, up to a certain extent, as long as you're hosting it on their cloud. Generally, it starts reaching a point where most of the pricing models for these, to be honest, tend to be per user. I'd say probably Code Commit is the cheapest one I've seen.
Yes, it's like $5 per month.
It's not even that. It's $1 per user.
Is it $1?
Oh, it's $1. You get the first 5 users free, and then it's $1 per user. Yep. And that tends to be the way the rest of them price themselves, but they tend to be, I'd say, closer to $5, $10, $15 per user. I mean, it all comes down to what the product is. Like, I'm sure Bitbucket's probably one of the more expensive ones because the Atlassian products tend to be a bit more expensive. But again, generally, if they're priced more, it's because there's a bigger feature set sitting on top of it. They think there's a value proposition to it.
So not a huge amount of money here.
No, and I mean, even if you go the route of hosting your own GitLab server, GitLab can run on a T2 Medium, so you're talking like $30 a month to run your own.
A T2 Medium is an instant type in Amazon.
Yeah.
Just making sure that we cover our vocabulary here. Okay, this has been absolutely insightful, Ryan. Thank you very much. I think we will delve into a future episode regarding what we can do with version control when it comes to the production and just general software management side of the fence. And also we'll talk about that thorny subject of what you shouldn't put in version control and what are my alternatives for that. Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.